Hello friends, welcome to Sci-Fi Traveler. Today I have a wonderful story for you. In this episode, we will hear the story of Gabriel and Adeline. Grab a refreshing coffee and lean back in your chair. Sci-Fi Traveler is about to begin. Gabriel had packed for 3 days and stayed for what felt like a minor eternity. His bag, a battered olive green thing that had survived 2 war zones and 1 catastrophic airport in Helsinki, sat in the corner of his quarters aboard the Valari diplomatic station like a quiet accusation. "You were supposed to be gone by Tuesday," it seemed to say. "It is now Friday. You have run out of clean socks. This is entirely your fault." He had not, technically, run out of clean socks. The Valari had offered him access to their laundering facilities on the first morning, which used some kind of ultrasonic resonance technology that cleaned fabric at the molecular level and made everything smell faintly of rain on warm stone. It was the single best thing about the summit. He had written that down in his personal notes between day 2. Trade corridor dispute unresolved, and day 2. Later, tried the Valari equivalent of coffee. Believe I briefly left my body. The summit itself had been a masterclass in elegant failure. 72 hours of talks that circled the same 3 disagreements like tired satellites, resource rights along the Cassian Belt, human colonial expansion into what the Valari considered ancestral transit space, and a third issue so diplomatically tangled that Gabriel had privately named it the thing we are not allowed to name yet. Both sides had shown up prepared. Both sides had smiled. Both sides had said, in their respective languages, approximately the same thing. "We want peace, provided peace looks exactly like what we already wanted before we arrived." Gabriel was not a diplomat. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He was a linguist. He had a doctorate in xenolinguistic pattern analysis, a modest apartment in Lisbon, a plant named Copernicus, who was almost certainly dead by now, and absolutely no business being the sole human representative at a summit that could reshape the political geography of 2 civilizations. He had been asked because the actual envoy, a career diplomat named something impressively forgettable, had developed an aggressive allergic reaction to the Valari atmospheric processors 40 minutes before departure. Gabriel had been standing nearby. He had clearance. He spoke passable Valari, not fluently, but well enough that the aliens looked at him with something other than pity, which in diplomatic terms was practically a standing ovation. He had spent the first day listening more than speaking, which everyone mistook for strategy. It was not strategy, it was terror wearing a calm face. By the second day, he had started to understand the room a little better. The Valari negotiators were precise, unhurried, and possessed of a particular conversational style that involved stating a position, allowing a silence that lasted 3 seconds longer than any human found comfortable, and then restating the same position with different vocabulary. It was, he realized, not stubbornness. It was ritual. They were waiting to see if you would flinch. He had learned by the afternoon of day 2 not to flinch. He simply waited them out, sipping the coffee-adjacent substance, and let the silence sit between them like a mutual agreement. This had earned him a reputation among the Valari delegation as someone with considerable stillness, which their chief negotiator, a sharp-eyed woman named Liana, had apparently said was a compliment of the highest order. Gabriel had thanked her and then gone back to his quarters and stared at the ceiling for 20 minutes, processing it. Queen Adeline had been present at the talks, but not in them. She sat at the far end of the chamber on a raised platform that wasn't quite a throne. The Valari were too architecturally subtle for thrones, but which functioned as one through sheer gravitational authority. She observed. She did not speak during sessions. She communicated occasionally with her lead negotiator through a series of gestures so minimal that Gabriel had spent considerable effort cataloging them in his notes. A slight angle of the chin, press forward. 2 fingers resting flat on the armrest. Hold. 1 slow blink. "I find this tiresome, and so do you. Let us all acknowledge this privately, and continue." He had not spoken to her directly. Protocol did not allow for it. She was the queen of a civilization that predated human space travel by roughly 800 years, and he was a man who had once locked his keys inside his own office 3 times in a single month. There was a hierarchy to these things. The banquet on the final evening was held in a hall that made Gabriel feel like he had walked sideways into a fever dream. The ceiling was an open dome through which Valara Prime's twin moons were visible, one pale silver, one the deep amber of old honey, and between them floated a slow procession of what appeared to be bioluminescent organisms, drifting like living lanterns through the pressurized warmth of the upper atmosphere. Silk banners in colors Gabriel had no names for moved in a current of recycled air. Candelabras of some burnished alloy that wasn't quite gold hovered at eye level, each one attended by a small anti-gravity ring so elegant it looked like jewelry rather than engineering. He stood near the edge of the room with a glass of something violet and lightly carbonated, wearing his best jacket, which was also his only jacket, and thinking that the gap between his world and this one had never felt quite so measurable, quite so honest, as it did in this room where everything was extraordinary and he was emphatically not. He was mid-thought. Specifically, the thought, I wonder if Copernicus is dead, when the hall went quiet. Queen Adeline rose from her seat at the head of the banquet table. She was tall in the way that certain ideas are tall, not in dimensions, but in presence. Her skin was the warm amber of the moon above them, and her violet eyes moved across the room with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once needed to raise her voice to fill a space. Her ears, the only feature that marked her, physically, as something other than human, curved to a soft, elegant point at the tips, half hidden beneath the dark architecture of her hair. She spoke in Valari, and the translation came through the small device behind Gabriel's ear with a half-second delay that always made him feel like he was watching a film slightly out of sync with itself. "The summit has concluded," she said, and her tone made this sound neither like a failure nor a success, but simply a fact that the universe had decided, and she was reporting it. "Before we part, I wish to make an offering, a gesture of goodwill between our peoples." She paused, and the 3-second Valari silence expanded into something much larger. "Choose any woman you want from my people, human." Her gaze moved to Gabriel with the precision of something calibrated. "A bond of kinship between our civilizations, sealed in the oldest way there is." Every eye in the hall turned to Gabriel. He looked at the assembled women of the Valari court, diplomats, scholars, warriors, each one remarkable in the particular way that people are remarkable when they have lived inside a civilization 8 centuries older than your own. He looked at the silk banners. He looked at the floating candelabras. He looked at his glass. He set it down. He looked at Adeline. "I want you, Queen," he said. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room holding its breath. It was the silence of a queen who had never once been chosen and had absolutely no idea what to do with the feeling. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Gabriel knew this because he counted them, the way you count seconds between lightning and thunder when you are trying to determine how much trouble is heading your way. 4 seconds was, apparently, a great deal of trouble. Then the hall exhaled. Not loudly. The Valari were too composed for anything as human as a collective gasp. But he felt it, a shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room, like a barometric drop before a storm. Liana, the chief negotiator, went very still in the particular way of someone whose entire professional career has just been picked up and shaken. 2 of the younger courtiers exchanged a glance that required no translation. The violet-lit candelabras drifted on, indifferent and luminous, because anti-gravity rings do not concern themselves with diplomatic incidents. Adeline herself had not moved. This was, Gabriel would later reflect, the most impressive thing he had ever witnessed. He had said something that had demonstrably rearranged the furniture of her internal world, and she had responded by becoming, if anything, more still. Her violet eyes rested on him with an expression he couldn't quite classify. "It lives somewhere in the territory between you have made a significant error, and I am going to need a moment." She gave herself that moment. She took it without apology, without performance. And when she spoke again, her voice had the same unhurried authority as before, which told him that whatever was happening behind her eyes, she had decided none of it would be visible. "You misunderstand the nature of the offer," she said, not unkindly. Almost gently. "The way you might explain gravity to someone who has just stepped off a ledge." "I understood it," Gabriel said. He wasn't entirely sure why he said it. Some part of him, the part that had survived 2 war zones, 1 Helsinki airport, and 72 hours of Valari negotiation, had apparently decided that the evening's most efficient path forward was honesty. This was, historically, not always that part's best idea. But there it was. Another silence, shorter this time. Escort the human envoy to the Eastern Reception Hall, Adeline said to no one and everyone in the specific tone of someone who has decided to deal with a situation privately before it becomes publicly interesting. She turned back to the table, lifted her glass, and the banquet resumed around her like a river finding its course again after a stone has been dropped in it. Gabriel was escorted. He went without argument because arguing with a royal escort in an alien diplomatic station was the sort of decision that aged you rapidly and accomplished nothing. The 2 Valari attendants who walked beside him were courteous, silent, and approximately a head taller than him, which he suspected was deliberate. The Eastern Reception Hall was smaller than the banquet room, which was to say it was only slightly more impressive than the most impressive room Gabriel had ever been in before tonight. The walls were a deep charcoal material that seemed to absorb light and return it softer, warmer, like stone that had been taught to be kind. A low table held a decanter of something amber and 2 glasses. Someone had anticipated, or at least prepared for, a private conversation. Gabriel was not sure whether that made him feel better or worse. He sat. He poured himself a glass of the amber liquid, thought about it, poured a second glass, and arranged them both on the table with the careful precision of a man filling time before something happened. The door opened 11 minutes later. He had counted those 2. Adeline entered alone. She had exchanged the formal layers of her banquet attire for something that managed to be simpler without being any less commanding. Deep blue, unembellished, with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need ornamentation. Her ears caught the low light of the room in a way that made them seem less regal and somehow more personal, like something you weren't meant to notice but couldn't help it. She looked at the 2 glasses on the table. "You poured mine already?" she said. "I didn't know when you'd arrive." It seemed optimistic. It is presumptuous. "I prefer optimistic." She sat across from him and picked up the glass, which he took as either acceptance or evidence that she intended to drink it before telling him exactly how wrong he was. Possibly both. "You are not what was expected," she said finally, with the careful phrasing of someone making an observation rather than a complaint. "I get that a lot," Gabriel said, "mostly from people who were expecting someone more qualified." The corner of her mouth moved. It was the smallest motion, a micro-expression, the kind his training had taught him to watch for in xenolinguistic exchanges, where so much of meaning lived in the half-degree shifts of a face. But he caught it, and it landed in his chest like something warm and slightly startling. "You are a linguist," she said. Not a question. She had clearly been briefed. "Yes." "Not a diplomat." Emphatically not. "And yet you were sent alone to the most significant cross-civilization summit in 40 years. "There was an allergy incident," Gabriel said. "I was standing nearby. The universe has a fairly aggressive sense of humor." She looked at him steadily, and he had the sensation he sometimes had with very old texts, that there was more information being transmitted than the surface layer suggested. That meaning was moving through the silence as much as through the words. "Why did you say what you said?" she asked, in the hall. He considered the question honestly, which was his only real mode of operation when exhausted. "Because I looked at every remarkable woman in that room," he said, "and the most remarkable one was the one who made the offer." The silence that followed was different from the one in the banquet hall. That one had been seismic. This one was quieter, closer to the texture of something that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to become. "What you said is not possible," Adeline said. "I am the queen of the Valari. I do not belong to any bond offering. The offer was made on behalf of my people. It was symbolic, diplomatic, a gesture of kinship. You were meant to choose someone else." "I know," Gabriel said. "And you chose anyway." "I did." She looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize. The 3-second silence, wearing a human-shaped face. Then she set down her glass with the quiet finality of someone making a decision that will take some time to fully understand. "You will remain on the station tonight," she said. "The accord is not yet signed. There are things that must still be resolved." "I thought the summit concluded," Gabriel said. "Summits," said Adeline with the faintest possible trace of something that wasn't quite amusement but lived in the same neighborhood. "Conclude when I say they conclude." She stood. She moved toward the door with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had never once needed to check if the room was watching. At the threshold she paused, not dramatically, not for effect, but in the way of someone who has thought of something and is deciding whether to say it. "Your Valari pronunciation," she said without turning, "is terrible." "I've been told it's passable," Gabriel said. "You were told incorrectly," she said, and left. Gabriel sat alone in the charcoal-walled room with 2 empty glasses and the particular feeling of a man who has just survived something he doesn't yet have a name for. Outside the narrow viewport above the table, Valara Prime's twin moons moved in their slow, ancient ellipsis, one silver, one amber, tracing the same path they had traced for 1,000 years before he was born, indifferent and patient and quietly, improbably beautiful. He thought about Copernicus the plant. He really hoped someone had watered him. He slept badly, which was not surprising, and woke to the Valari equivalent of morning, which was announced not by sunlight but by a soft shift in the station's atmospheric lighting. A slow tide of warmth moving through the corridor outside his quarters, amber deepening to gold, as though the station itself were stretching and deciding to be awake. It was, objectively, a more elegant system than an alarm clock. Gabriel still missed his alarm clock. It was loud and unreasonable, and made him feel like the day was something to be wrestled with, rather than eased into, which was, he had come to accept, simply his preferred relationship with mornings. He sat on the edge of his sleeping platform. The Valari word for it translated approximately as the place of horizontal thinking, which he found either very poetic or mildly pretentious depending on his mood, and reviewed the previous evening with the methodical honesty of a man doing damage assessment. He had told the queen of an 800-year-old civilization that he wanted her, in a room full of her court, in front of her entire diplomatic delegation, with a glass of violet carbonated liquid in his hand. He pressed his palms against his eyes and sat with that for a moment. Then he got up because there was nothing else to do. Breakfast in his quarters arrived via a small panel in the wall that dilated open with the soft precision of a camera aperture, one of those Valari design details that seem to have been engineered specifically to make humans feel like they were living inside a very elegant short film. The tray held something grain-based and warm, a small bowl of fruit he mostly recognized, and the rain-on-warm stone coffee. He ate without tasting much of it, running linguistic analysis in the back of his mind the way he always did when he was nervous, parsing last night's conversation with Adeline for subtext, for the microstructures of meaning that lived beneath Valari formal speech. She had not dismissed him. That was the first thing. She had not called the offer void, had not invoked protocol, had not done any of the 17 things a head of state had every right and reason to do when a foreign linguist said something structurally insane at a state banquet. She had taken him to a private room, which was itself a choice. She had sat across from him and asked him a real question. Why did you say what you said? Which meant she wanted a real answer, which meant something in her had not immediately closed the door on the subject. She had also told him his pronunciation was terrible, which in the context of everything else felt either deeply irrelevant or the most revealing thing she'd said. He hadn't decided which. His translation device sat on the small table beside the tray, its indicator light a steady Valari green. He picked it up and ran the previous night's conversation back through his own memory, this time listening not for what she said, but for how she said it. The specific cadences of Valari formal register versus the places where her phrasing had shifted, slightly, into something less constructed. There had been 2 such moments. When she'd said, "You are not what was expected," and at the very end, when she'd paused at the door. He was still thinking about the pause at the door when a soft chime indicated someone was outside his quarters. It was Liana. She stood in the corridor with the expression of a woman who had been awake since approximately 4 in the morning and had spent the intervening hours composing what she wanted to say. She was somewhere in her 50s by human reckoning, though Valari age markers were different enough that he was guessing, and she had the particular energy of someone who was extremely competent and currently extremely inconvenienced. "Envoy Gabriel," she said. "Good morning," he said. "Is it?" she said, in a tone that suggested the question was rhetorical and the answer was no. "The Queen has requested your presence for the morning review of the outstanding accord terms." Gabriel blinked. "The accord?" "Yes. The summit that concluded last night." "The summit," Liana said carefully, with the air of someone choosing each word like a stepping stone across uncertain water, "has been extended by royal decree. Certain matters require further deliberation." "Certain matters," Gabriel repeated. Liana looked at him with an expression that communicated in the universal language of exhausted professionals everywhere that she was aware of exactly what certain matters meant and had opinions about it that she was professionally obligated not to share. "Shall I tell the Queen you will attend?" "Yes," Gabriel said. "Give me 10 minutes." He spent 8 of those minutes making himself presentable, and 2 of them standing in front of the narrow viewport looking at Valara Prime below, a planet of extraordinary amber and deep green, swathed in the thin luminous haze of its upper atmosphere, looking from orbit like something a painter had made in a mood of restrained optimism. The Cassian belt was visible from here on clear days, a faint shimmer at the edge of the star field, like light caught in old glass. He had spent 3 days arguing about it in a conference room. From up here, it looked like something that should have a poem written about it rather than a trade dispute. He put on his jacket. His only jacket. He really needed to get another jacket. The morning review was held in the smaller of the 2 formal chambers, still larger and more architecturally ambitious than anything Gabriel had ever worked in, but approachable by Valari standards, which is to say it only made him feel mildly like an exhibit. The long table had been reduced to a shorter configuration, and the delegation on both sides was smaller. Liana sat at the Valari end, with 2 advisors he recognized. Gabriel sat at the human end, which meant he sat alone, which he was used to by now. Adelaine was not present. He was approximately 20 minutes into a detailed re-examination of the Cassian belt transit rights, making points he had already made twice and listening to responses he had already heard twice, all of it conducted with the collegial mutual stubbornness that passed for progress in high-level diplomacy, when the chamber door opened and she walked in. She sat at the head of the table, as she had every day of the summit, on the platform that wasn't quite a throne but functioned as one. She wore something the color of deep water, formal without being elaborate. Her ears caught the chamber's cool light in the same way they'd caught the warm light of the reception room the night before, a detail he noticed and then immediately noted that he had noticed, which was its own kind of information. She did not look at him directly for the first 15 minutes. He suspected this was deliberate. He also suspected, from the slight angle of her chin, that gesture he'd catalogued, press forward, that she was listening to the proceedings more carefully than her stillness suggested. The discussion moved to the second disputed point, the colonial expansion boundaries, and Gabriel found his footing in a way he hadn't on the previous days. He was tired and somewhat emotionally disorganized, but there was something clarifying about having already done the most alarming thing in the room. Everything after telling a queen you wanted her was, comparatively, manageable. He made the human position plain in simple Valari, apologizing in advance for his pronunciation, which got him the first genuine laugh from the Valari advisors he'd heard in 3 days, a sound like struck crystal, and then he said something he hadn't planned to say. He said that perhaps the disagreement was not about the boundaries themselves, but about what the boundaries represented, a fear on the Valari side that humanity expanded the way certain stars expanded, consuming everything in the process of becoming something larger, and a fear, on the human side, of being found insufficient by a civilization that had already seen everything humans were still reaching for. The chamber was quiet after that. Not the formal Valari 3-second silence, but something less structured. Something that had heard itself and was thinking. Adeline looked at him then. Not at the table, not at the delegation. At him specifically, with those violet eyes that were beginning to feel less like a formal diplomatic feature and more like something he was going to have to reckon with seriously and soon. "We will recess," she said quietly, "for 1 hour." As the room began to clear, Liana passed Gabriel's chair and leaned slightly toward him without breaking stride, in the manner of someone imparting information efficiently. "She has not recessed a session in 11 years, she said, almost inaudibly. Gabriel watched the empty doorway where Adeline had been. "Is that good?" he asked. Liana kept walking. "I have absolutely no idea," she said, which was the most honest thing anyone had said to him since he arrived, and he found it genuinely comforting. The recess took place in a corridor, not a grand one, not one of the wide, luminous passageways that connected the station's ceremonial chambers, with their slow-moving light panels and their carved alloy reliefs depicting 8 centuries of Valari astronomical achievement. This was a service corridor, narrower, utilitarian by Valari standards, which still meant the walls had a subtle geometric texture and the floor was a deep charcoal composite that absorbed sound with improbable efficiency. Gabriel had found it on the second day of the summit when he was looking for a bathroom and had taken 3 wrong turns through the station's labyrinthine interior. He had eaten lunch here yesterday, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, because it was the only place on the entire station where nobody seemed to be watching him represent the totality of human civilization. He went there during the recess without quite deciding to. His feet made the choice while his mind was still processing the morning session, which was how he knew he was tired. His body had started acting on instinct, while his cognition lagged somewhere 2 decisions behind. He sat on the floor. He leaned against the wall. He looked at the ceiling, which was lower here, and therefore less philosophically challenging than most Valari ceilings. He had been there perhaps 7 minutes when he heard footsteps. He turned his head. Adeline stood at the near end of the corridor, which should have been surprising, and was instead something else. Something that felt less like coincidence and more like the universe making a point it had been working toward for a while. She looked at him sitting on the floor of a service corridor in his only jacket, and he looked at her standing in the entrance in something the color of deep water, and neither of them said anything for a moment that was almost comfortable. "Do you often sit on the floor?" she asked. "During diplomatic recesses?" "Only when the ceilings are overwhelming," Gabriel said. She looked up briefly at the corridor ceiling. Then she looked back at him. Something in her expression, not quite bemusement, not quite curiosity, something that lived between them, shifted almost imperceptibly. She moved further into the corridor, which meant she had decided to stay, which meant Gabriel's heart did something mildly unprofessional that he chose to ignore. She did not sit on the floor. She stood, one shoulder inclined slightly toward the wall, which was as close to casual as her posture apparently allowed. Her ears, half hidden beneath the dark architecture of her hair, caught the corridor's low service lighting and gave it back warmer. He was beginning to understand that this was simply what they did. Returned light differently depending on the source, the way certain materials have different refractive indices. It was a feature of the physical world. He was cataloging it for purely observational reasons. "What you said in the session," she began. "I know," Gabriel said. "It was not what we expected from the human position." "It was not what I expected from the human position either. It came out before I'd fully reviewed it." "You speak before you review," she said, and her tone was not quite an accusation, and not quite a question, but something calibrated precisely between them. "Apparently it's a pattern," Gabriel said. "I did it at the banquet, too." Her chin dropped a fraction. It was not one of the formal gestures he'd catalogued. This was something smaller, less ceremonial, more internal. She was thinking about something and had briefly let him see her doing it, which struck him, somehow, as the most unguarded thing she had done in 4 days. "What you said about fear," she said finally, "about what the boundaries represent. Where did that come from?" "From 3 days of listening," he said. "It's what I'm actually here for. The diplomacy is... I'm not good at the diplomacy, the listening I can do. Your civilization sent someone who was good at listening to a summit that required someone good at talking. The person who was good at talking is in a hospital in Geneva with hives, Gabriel said. The universe distributes its resources unpredictably. The corner of her mouth did the thing again. That minimal motion, that near imperceptible shift. It was becoming his primary object of study, and he was going to have to address that with himself at some point. The Valari have a concept, she said, for which your language has no direct translation. It means, approximately, the right person arriving through the wrong door. Gabriel considered this. Is that a compliment? It is an observation, Adeline said. Whether it is a compliment depends on what the right person does after arriving. He looked at her steadily, the way she'd taught him without meaning to by doing it herself. I'd like to ask you something, he said. And I'd like you to answer it as yourself rather than as the queen, if that's possible. The silence she gave him was not the formal 3-second diplomatic pause. It was longer, more personal, and when she emerged from it, she said, "Ask," in a register that was quieter than anything he'd heard from her so far. Last night, when I said what I said, what was the first thing you felt? Not the protocol response. The first thing. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. The station hummed around them, its atmospheric processors cycling through their low, constant frequency, a sound he'd stopped hearing after the first day but could still feel in the background, like a pulse that didn't belong to either of them. Surprise, she said at last, with the particular care of someone who has selected a word from a much larger and more complicated set of words. I felt surprise. I have been queen for 30 years. I have conducted 4 summits, 2 territorial negotiations, and 1 dissolution of an allied treaty that took 11 months. In all of it, no one has ever... She stopped, began again. The offer I made was ceremonial, understood by everyone in that room to be symbolic. No one was meant to choose me. I was not a choice that was available. And yet, Gabriel said. And yet, she agreed quietly. He let the silence be what it needed to be. Outside the corridor's single viewport, a narrow horizontal aperture, purely functional, the kind that existed for structural monitoring rather than observation. The star field moved at the slow pace of orbital mechanics, ancient and indifferent and magnificent. Can I tell you what I actually saw? He said. She looked at him. I saw a room full of remarkable people, Gabriel said. And I saw the one who had arranged everything, who had offered everything, standing at the center of it with the kind of authority that doesn't need a room to behave a certain way, but gets it anyway. And I thought, this is the person who understands what this summit actually means. Not the trade corridors, not the transit rights, the actual thing, the 2 civilizations trying to decide whether they trust each other. And I thought... He stopped, ran a hand through his hair in the involuntary way he did when he was about to say something he hadn't prepared. I thought, if I'm going to be here, if I came through the wrong door and ended up in the right place, then I should at least be honest, even if it's inconvenient. Adeline looked at him for a long, measured moment. Her expression had moved through several things he couldn't name and settled into something quieter, more uncertain than anything he'd seen from her. Uncertainty, on a face accustomed to composure, was extraordinary. Not because it diminished her, but because it made her real in a way that composure, for all its impressiveness, didn't quite manage. Your pronunciation really is terrible, she said. Gabriel laughed. It came out slightly more relieved than he intended. You mentioned that. Valari nei sutha korath, she said, the phrase he'd used in the session to describe human expansion. You said nei sutha when you meant nei suthaya. The distinction changes the sentence from a description to an accusation. Wonderful, Gabriel said. So I accidentally accused humanity of something in front of your entire delegation. They found it clarifying, Adeline said, and this time the curve of her mouth was unmistakable. Not a smile quite, but the architecture of one. The preliminary structure of a thing that, given sufficient time and adequate conditions, might become a smile. Teach me, Gabriel said. The correct pronunciation. She looked at him with those violet eyes and the expression that lived between observation and something warmer. "Ne Suthia," she said, and the word in her mouth had a quality his translation device would never capture. Something in the Valari vowel structure that sat in the back of the throat and resonated slightly, less like speech and more like a small, precise piece of music. He tried it. He got it wrong. She corrected him. He got it less wrong. The recess lasted an hour, and they spent 40 minutes of it in a service corridor with low ceilings and a narrow viewport, and no one signed anything or resolved anything or changed the political geography of two civilizations. But when they walked back toward the formal chambers, the distance between them was slightly different from what it had been. Not smaller exactly, but changed in quality, the way air changes before rain, charged with the particular electricity of things that are about to become something else. The afternoon session ended without resolution, which was, by this point, something Gabriel had stopped being surprised by and started being almost fond of. There was a rhythm to the unresolved, a familiar texture to the moments when two civilizations looked at each other across a table and said in their respective languages, "We are not there yet, but we have not stopped trying," which was, if you were being generous, a form of progress. He had started being generous around day 2. It was that, or despair, and despair required energy he didn't have. Liana caught him in the corridor outside the chamber as the delegations dispersed into the station's quieter evening configuration, the lighting cycling down by gradual degrees, the atmospheric processors shifting to a slightly warmer mix that the Valari apparently found conducive to rest and reflection. She walked beside him with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had things to say and had allocated exactly enough time to say them. "The Queen has invited you to the observatory," she said. Gabriel kept walking. "The station has an observatory?" "The station has many things you have not yet seen," Liana said, with the faint implication that this was somehow his fault. "Level 7. The attendant will show you." She paused, and he could feel her choosing her next words with the care of a woman diffusing something delicate. "This is not a formal engagement. It is not on the diplomatic record." "I understand," Gabriel said. "I want to be certain that you understand," Liana said, stopping, which made him stop, and looking at him with the expression of someone who has decided to be direct because the alternative is worse. "The Queen is—" She stopped again, started differently. "She has governed this civilization since she was 26 years old. She has not, in that time, made many personal decisions. Almost all of her decisions have been institutional ones. Do you understand the distinction? Gabriel looked at her. "Yes," he said, more quietly. Liana nodded once with the efficient gravity of someone who has discharged a responsibility and intends to say nothing further on the subject. "Level 7, she repeated, and walked away. He found the observatory by following the attendant, a young Valari, with the focused helpfulness of someone who took their role very seriously, through 2 lifts and a passageway that curved upward in a slow arc before opening without announcement into a room that made Gabriel stop walking entirely for a moment just to process it. The observatory dome was transparent, not glass, something finer than glass, a synthetic crystal compound that the Valari used in their deep space optical arrays, and it curved over and around in a full sphere, so that standing inside it felt less like being in a room and more like being held inside the dark with nothing between you and everything. Valara Prime was below and to the left, amber green and luminous, trailing the thin silver thread of a weather system across its northern continent. The twin moons were both visible, converging toward their monthly alignment. The Cassian belt shimmered at the starfield's edge, and beyond it, if you knew where to look, Gabriel knew where to look. There was a faint smear of light that was the outer reach, where human colonial ships had been pushing boundaries that a queen and a linguist had spent 3 days arguing about in a room with no windows. From here, it all looked less like a dispute and more like a painting. Adeline was standing at the dome's center on a low circular platform that existed, apparently for exactly this purpose, the purpose of standing inside the universe and looking at it properly. She had changed again into something darker, simpler, and she stood with her hands loosely at her sides and her face tilted slightly upward, the way people stand when they are not performing anything for anyone and have briefly forgotten to manage their expression. He climbed the 3 steps to the platform and stood beside her. Not too close, not diplomatically far, somewhere in the middle distance that had been slowly, without announcement, becoming their natural register. "Leanna told you this is not on the record," Adeline said. "She did." "Good." A pause. "I wanted to speak without the table between us." Gabriel looked up through the dome at the slow wheel of stars. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," he said. "About the right person through the wrong door." "What about it?" "I've been the wrong door person my entire career," he said. "Wrong door, wrong room, wrong building occasionally. I ended up at my first xenolinguistics conference because I misread a campus map and wandered into the lecture theater by accident. Stayed for 3 hours. Changed the direction of my life." He paused. "The map was very confusing in my defense." "Your entire field," Adeline said, "was entered through a wrong door." "And yet here I am," Gabriel said, "which is either an argument for the chaos theory of professional development or evidence that the universe has a very specific sense of humor." "The Valari do not believe in chaos," she said. "We believe in patterns too large to see from inside them." Gabriel considered this. "That's either very wise or a very sophisticated way of saying the same thing." She turned to look at him, and the dome's ambient light, starlight filtered through crystal, the soft reflected glow of a world below, caught her face in a way that was doing nothing to help his ability to think clearly. "Tell me about your world," she said. "Not the political position, not the colonial expansion figures, your world." He took a breath. "It's loud," he said. "That's the first thing. Compared to this?" He gestured at the composed, resonant silence of the observatory. "Earth is extraordinarily loud. There are 9 billion people, and most of them seem to be having a strong opinion about something at all times. It's chaotic and frequently maddening, and the weather is unreliable, and the coffee is inconsistent, and the political systems are—" He searched for a word. "Ambitious in their dysfunction." He paused. "But there's something in it. In the mess of it. People make art in the middle of disasters. They fall in love during arguments. They find humor in things that are genuinely terrible because the alternative is unbearable. There's a—" He stopped, trying to find the precise thing, the exact word, which was his particular disease as a linguist. Always wanting the right word, always aware of how inadequate the available ones were. "There's a stubbornness to humans that looks like recklessness from outside but feels, from inside, like hope." The silence that followed was not diplomatic. It was the silence of someone receiving information that has landed somewhere real. "We find humans frightening," Adeline said after a while. "I want to say that plainly, since we are speaking without the table." "I know," Gabriel said. "I've been reading it in the subtext for 3 days. Not because you are violent, though there is that. Because you are—" She paused, and he watched her search for the word the way he recognized himself doing it, that internal reach for precision. "Because you are so willing to become something new. The Valari change slowly. We are deliberate. We do not move until we are certain. And humans." She looked out through the dome at the distant smear of light that was the human frontier. "Humans move before they are ready, and somehow arrive." "It terrifies you," Gabriel said. "It does," she said without defense. "We're terrified too," Gabriel said, "of being out here and finding that everything we've built looks small from the outside, which is—" He looked at Valara Prime below them, ancient and amber and utterly beautiful. "Which is exactly what it does look like, from out here." She was quiet. The observatory held them both in its crystal sphere, the universe arranged around them with the magnificent indifference of something that has been going on for 13 billion years and intends to continue regardless. "Why did you really say it?" she said. "In the hall. I asked you last night, and you gave me an answer that was true, but it was not the whole truth. I have spent 30 years listening to people give me partial truths, and I know the shape of them." Gabriel was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because I've been in rooms my whole life where I could see what was real and couldn't say it. Because being sent through the wrong door to the right place felt like being given permission, for once, to say the actual thing." He paused. And because you were looking at that room with the expression of someone who had arranged everything for everyone else and hadn't arranged anything for yourself, and that, he stopped. That, she said quietly, when he didn't finish. That was familiar, he said. That was very familiar. The twin moons of Valara Prime moved toward their alignment above them, slow and silver and amber, tracing the same arc they had traced for 1,000 years before either of them existed. And in the observatory, in the light of everything, Adeline turned to look at him with an expression he could not catalog, could not parse, could not file neatly into the index of gestures he'd been building since he arrived. Because it was not a formal expression, not a diplomatic one, not the expression of a queen managing a situation. It was just her face, unmanaged, uncertain and precise, and something that lived several addresses past remarkable. Your pronunciation of Suthia was better this afternoon, she said finally. Gabriel looked at the stars. I had a good teacher, he said. And for the first time since he had arrived through the wrong door into the right place, in the quiet of a crystal observatory above an amber world, Queen Adeline of the Valari laughed. It was brief and a little startled, as though it had surprised her too, the laugh of someone who had forgotten for a moment that they were allowed. It was the best thing Gabriel had heard in 4 days, possibly longer. The accord was signed at dawn, not the ceremonial dawn of the banquet hall, with its floating candelabras and its bioluminescent ceiling. This was the real one, the station's atmospheric lighting cycling through its slow tide of amber to gold, while Valara Prime turned below them and the twin moons completed their alignment and began, with the patient unhurriedness of things that have been doing this for 1,000 years, to separate again. Gabriel stood at the window of the small antechamber outside the signing room and watched the planet turn and thought about how strange it was that history so often happened in rooms adjacent to the view. He had not slept. Not from anxiety exactly. The anxiety had been present earlier in the week when he was still pretending the situation was manageable. What kept him awake through the observatory night and into the slow hours before dawn was something quieter and less comfortable than anxiety. It was the specific wakefulness of a person who has understood something about themselves and is still in the process of deciding what to do with the understanding. He had spent his career in the spaces between languages, in the gaps where one civilization's meaning didn't quite translate into another's, where the most important things were always the things that resisted direct expression. He had been good at it, good at listening, at decoding, at finding the underlying structure beneath the surface of what was said. What he had not been good at, what he was only now beginning to understand he had been actively avoiding, was applying the same attention to his own interior. It was a fairly common failure mode in people who were very skilled at understanding others. He had catalogued the expressions of an alien queen with more precision than he had ever turned on himself. The observatory had changed something, not because anything had been declared, nothing had been declared, they were both too honest and too careful for declarations, but because something had been seen. He had been seen, not as an envoy, not as a wrong door accident, not as a diplomatic incident, as himself. And he had seen her in the same unmediated way, and neither of them had found the experience anything other than, he searched as always for the right word, necessary. It had felt necessary, like a translation finally running in both directions. Liana appeared at the antechamber door with the expression of a woman who had also not slept and had made peace with this hours ago. They are ready, she said. The signing room was spare by Valari standards, a single long table, the accord document laid out on its surface in both languages, 2 chairs. The Valari script ran down the right side of the parchment in its characteristic vertical columns, each character precise and unhurried. The human script ran down the left in the horizontal lines that always looked slightly breathless by comparison, as though the words were in a hurry to get somewhere. Gabriel had always found this an interesting metaphor and was choosing not to think about it too hard right now. Adeline entered from the far door. She wore deep burgundy, formal, the color of something concluded. Her bearing was composed in the way it always was, the composure that had governed 4 summits and 2 territorial negotiations and 1 very long service corridor conversation. But there was something underneath it now that he could read, that he suspected he was one of very few people in any room ever permitted to read, which was the particular aliveness of someone who has recently been surprised by themselves. She sat. Gabriel sat across from her. Liana and the remaining advisors arranged themselves at the room's perimeter in the way of people who are present for history and have been professional enough to bring their pens. The terms, Adeline said, addressing the room, are as follows. She outlined them with the quiet authority of a woman who had held civilizations in her voice for 30 years. The Cassian Belt transit rights, shared and governed by a joint commission, a Volari concession that had taken 3 days to reach and 1 corridor conversation to unlock. The colonial expansion boundaries, redrawn not by political pressure, but by the framework Gabriel had offered in the morning session, the one that had come out before he'd reviewed it, a buffer zone structured not as a limit, but as a meeting ground, a space that belonged to neither civilization and therefore, in the way of such things, to both. The thing we are not allowed to name yet had been quietly renamed in the final overnight deliberations as the Cultural Exchange Initiative, which was either a triumph of diplomatic euphemism or a genuine beginning, depending on how the next 10 years went. He had been part of making this. Not despite coming through the wrong door, but because of it. Because he had walked in without the calcified positions of a career diplomat, without the investment in previous frameworks, and had simply listened until he understood what everyone was actually afraid of and then said it out loud. He wasn't sure if that was a talent or a personality defect. Possibly both. The two categories had more overlap than was generally acknowledged. Adeline slid the accord across the table. He read it. The human side first, then the Volari, his eye moving through the vertical script with the particular pleasure of a man reading in a language that still felt like a gift he hadn't quite earned. Everything was correct. Everything that needed to be there was there. He signed his name. It looked very small on a document of this size. His handwriting had always been slightly too casual for official use. His doctoral advisor had mentioned this repeatedly, and it looked no more distinguished now than it ever had. Gabriel, it said, in letters that were doing their best. Adeline signed beside it. Her script was Volari, her name rendered in vertical characters that were simultaneously precise and elegant, the way everything Volari was simultaneously precise and elegant, and seeing their names beside each other on the same page did something to the inside of his chest that he chose to note and file and return to later. The accord is witnessed, Liana said into the room's formal quiet. Let it be recorded. The advisors moved forward. Documents were produced. The machinery of history began its administrative processing, which was, in Gabriel's experience, always slightly anticlimactic. The actual moment always smaller and quieter than the weight of what it carried. The advisors filed out. Liana was last. At the door, she paused, and Gabriel thought she was going to say something about protocol, about departure schedules, about the transport that would return him to the human relay station and then to Lisbon and his almost certainly dead plant. Instead, she looked at the two of them, still seated at the table, and said nothing at all, which communicated everything, and left. The room was quiet. The accord sat between them, signed and witnessed and permanent. You are leaving today, Adeline said. Not a question. That was the schedule, Gabriel said. Is it still your schedule? He looked at her. That depends on whether the summit has actually concluded. The accord is signed, she said. The summit has concluded. A pause. There is, however, a secondary matter. The Cultural Exchange Initiative, Gabriel said. Among other things. She looked at him with those violet eyes that he was now absolutely certain he was not going to be able to stop thinking about from a significant distance for a significant amount of time. The initiative requires a human liaison, someone with language capacity and cultural analytical experience and... She paused. And the pause had a quality he recognized now, the place where her formal register gave way to something less constructed. Considerable stillness. Gabriel was quiet for a moment. You're offering me a job. I am identifying a diplomatic necessity, Adeline said, with the composure of a woman who has decided to accomplish two things simultaneously and is not going to acknowledge this openly. Those are not mutually exclusive, Gabriel said. The corner of her mouth moved, the preliminary architecture of the thing that had, in the observatory, briefly and unexpectedly become a real laugh. No, she said. They are not. He looked at the accord between them, at their names beside each other in two different scripts, at the window where Velara Prime turned in its ancient amber patience below. He thought about Lisbon. He thought about Copernicus, who was, he had come to accept, almost certainly beyond saving, though he intended to try. He thought about the wrong door and the right place, and the pattern too large to see from inside it. He thought about a service corridor with low ceilings and a laugh in an observatory that had sounded startled, as though it had surprised the person it came from. "My pronunciation needs work," he said. "Considerably," Adeline agreed. "I'd need a teacher. The initiative would provide resources. And the ceilings on this station are genuinely overwhelming." "You will acclimate," she said, and something in the word will, its quiet certainty, its assumption of a future, settled into the room like the last piece of something finding its place. He nodded once, in the way of someone who has made a decision that was probably made several days ago and is only now being formally acknowledged. "I'll need to go back first," he said. "There's a plant." Adeline looked at him with an expression he had no name for and had stopped trying to catalog because some things were not meant to be filed, they were meant to be felt and then carried. "Of course," she said. He stood. She stood. They were on the same side of the table now, the accord behind them, the universe arranged beyond the window in its magnificent, indifferent complexity. The twin moons drifting apart, the Cassian belt shimmering at the edge of everything, the faint distant light of the human frontier where two civilizations were going to have to learn, slowly and imperfectly and with considerable stubbornness on both sides, to trust each other. It occurred to Gabriel that this was what he did. This was what he had always done, in the wrong door, right place way of his entire life, found the space between languages and stood in it, and listened, and occasionally said the true thing before he'd reviewed it. It had never before mattered quite so much. He thought it might, going forward, matter more than anything else he'd done. "Velari ne suthea," he said carefully. His best attempt, the one she had corrected him toward in the corridor, the description rather than the accusation. She listened to it, considered it. "Better," she said. "Still not good." "I have time," Gabriel said. Adeline looked at him, and her face in the dawn light of a signed accord was unmanaged and precise, and something he had no word for in any language he spoke, which meant, he supposed, that he would have to stay until he found one. "Yes," she said quietly. "You do." Outside, Velara Prime turned. The moons moved on their ancient ellipsis. The Cassian belt shimmered between two civilizations that had not yet learned to trust each other but had this morning written down their intention to try. And in a small room adjacent to the view, two people stood on the same side of a table where their names had been written beside each other and did not say anything further because some things, the truest things, the ones that live in the space between one language and another, do not need to be said at all. Friends, we've reached the end of Adeline and Gabriel's story. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to click the like button. Leave your thoughts about the story in the comments below and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next science fiction story. See you in the next story, friends.